Have you ever wondered why, in a world overflowing with information, so many of us still feel lost? We can search for anything in seconds, facts, data, endless streams of advice. And yet deep down we sense something is missing. Knowledge is everywhere, but wisdom is rare. Knowledge tells us how to build a faster car, but wisdom asks where that car should take us. Knowledge explains how to grow more food, but wisdom teaches us how to share it without greed. Knowledge is about accumulation. Wisdom is about transformation. Since the beginning of time, humans have searched for more than facts. We've looked up at the night sky not just to count the stars, but to ask, who are we? Why are we here? The child who keeps asking why. The old man staring quietly at a river, the monk meditating under a tree. All of them are seeking the same thing, not just knowledge, but a deeper way of seeing. And here lies a profound truth. Wisdom arises when we learn to look deeply. Looking deeply doesn't mean staring harder with our eyes. It means seeing beneath the surface of things, beyond appearances, into the very heart of reality. It's the difference between seeing a flower and realizing that within that flower are clouds, rain, soil, and sunlight. It's the difference between hearing someone's angry words and recognizing the hidden pain behind them. But here's the challenge. In modern life, we've been trained to skim the surface. We scroll, we swipe, we consume, but we rarely pause long enough to see what truly lies beneath. And so we fill our heads with information while our hearts starve for wisdom. True wisdom changes how we walk through life. It softens our anger, it deepens our compassion, it frees us from illusions that keep us trapped in cycles of suffering. It's not about knowing more, it's about seeing differently. Think of the Buddha under the Bodhi tree. He didn't gain enlightenment by memorizing more scriptures or debating more philosophers. He simply sat still, breathing, observing, looking deeply into his own mind and the nature of existence. And from that deep seeing, wisdom blossomed like a lotus rising from the mud. Each of us carries that same potential. Each of us can learn to look deeply at ourselves, at others, at life itself. And when we do, the world begins to reveal its secrets. What once seemed ordinary becomes extraordinary. What once felt confusing becomes clear. What once brought us endless suffering begins to loosen its grip. This journey we are about to take together is not just a study of ideas. It is an invitation to shift the way you see, to move from collecting knowledge to cultivating wisdom, to walk a path where every breath, every moment, every encounter can become a doorway into understanding. So let us begin this exploration, because the search for wisdom is not about escaping life. It's about learning to embrace it more fully. And as we start to look deeply, we'll discover that wisdom is not some distant treasure. It has always been here, waiting quietly beneath the surface, like clear water beneath the soil. When we dare to dig, when we dare to look beyond what is obvious, we may find that the world and our own hearts are far richer than we ever imagined. And so, the question unfolds. If wisdom comes from looking deeply, how do we begin? How do we train the eye of the heart to see beyond appearances, to touch the essence of things? That's where our journey now turns. We live in a world obsessed with surfaces. The smile in a photo, the number in a bank account, the title on a business card. These are the things people rush to see, to judge, to compare. But life is never just the surface. Think of a lake on a windy day. The waves ripple, shimmer, and sometimes crash against the shore. But beneath those restless ripples lies a stillness, a depth that the surface alone could never reveal. Looking deeply means diving beneath those ripples. It is learning to see what the eyes cannot grasp at first glance. When the Buddha spoke of insight, he spoke of this kind of vision, not ordinary sight, but a seeing with the heart, a seeing that pierces illusions. He called it vipassana, clear seeing, deep seeing. Most of the time, our attention is scattered, like sunlight broken into fragments. We skim over people's words without hearing their pain. We consume the beauty of a flower without realizing the entire universe has gathered in it. We notice our stress without recognizing the hidden fears that fuel it. To look deeply is to pause. It is to allow yourself enough silence, enough stillness to see the roots, not just the branches, Take something as simple as a sheet of paper. At first, it looks like nothing more than a blank surface. But look deeper. In that paper, you can see the tree from which it came. In the tree, you can see the rain, the sunshine, the soil. In the rain, you see the ocean. In the sunshine, you see the cosmos. So when you hold a single sheet of paper in your hand, you are holding the entire universe. This is the art of deep looking, to train your mind to see connections, to pierce through appearances, to touch reality at its core. But make no mistake, this is not a passive practice. It requires courage. Because when we truly look, we may see things we once avoided. We may see our own anger, our hidden wounds, the suffering we've caused to others. Looking deeply means facing truths that are not always comfortable. Yet it is only by facing them that wisdom can arise. Think of relationships. On the surface, someone's harsh words may feel like an attack, but look deeply and you may see their fear, their exhaustion, their loneliness. What seemed like anger turns out to be a cry for understanding. And suddenly, compassion blossoms where only resentment once lived. This is why deep looking is more than philosophy. It is a way of living, a way of transforming how we meet each moment. Imagine what would change if we all looked a little deeper, at ourselves before we judged others, at the earth before we consumed without thought, at each fleeting moment before letting it slip away unnoticed. To practice deep looking is to reclaim our capacity to wonder. It is to walk through life with open eyes, open ears, and above all, an open heart. And here lies the secret. The more deeply we look, the more we realize nothing exists in isolation. Every smile, every tear, every breath is woven into an infinite web of connections. To see this is to step closer to wisdom. And so the path continues. For when we learn to look beyond the surface, we begin to discover a profound truth. Nothing in this world stands alone. Every flower, every thought, every life is interwoven with countless others. It is here, in the mystery of interconnection, that wisdom begins to bloom. If you look closely at a single drop of water, you will see the clouds. If you hold a piece of bread in your hand, you are holding the sun, the rain, the soil, and the farmer's sweat. When we look deeply, it becomes impossible to find anything that exists on its own. This is the great teaching of interconnection. The Buddha called it pratityasamutpada, dependent origination. It means that everything arises because of countless conditions and nothing can exist by itself. It's easy to believe that we are separate, me and you, this and that, self and world. But when we look with wisdom, those boundaries begin to dissolve. Think of the air you breathe right now. It was once inside a tree. It may have passed through the lungs of a bird or even another human being centuries ago. In every breath, you are connected to life itself. Or think of the meal you ate today. On the surface, it was just food on a plate. But look deeper. There is the farmer who planted the seed, the rain clouds that watered it, the earth that nourished it, the truck that carried it, the countless hands that made it possible for you to eat. To eat a single grain of rice is to eat the whole universe. This truth is not just poetry, it is reality. And when we realize it, everything changes. Because if nothing exists alone, then our actions never affect just ourselves. Every word we speak, every choice we make, ripples outward into the web of life. A kind word can heal a heart. A careless action can wound generations. The illusion of separateness makes us selfish. The insight of interconnection makes us compassionate. Consider this. When you hurt someone with your words, you are not only hurting them. Their pain reflects back on you because you are not separate from them. When you bring joy to another, their happiness becomes your own. It's like playing a note on a guitar string. The vibration spreads and soon the entire instrument resonates. This is why wisdom begins with deep looking. Because when we see the web of life, we stop living only for ourselves. We start to live with care, with responsibility, with love. But here's the paradox. Even though interconnection is the truth, we rarely notice it. Modern life tells us to be independent, to stand alone, to chase our own success. Yet deep inside, we know. No tree grows without the forest. No person thrives without community. No being lives without the earth. When we awaken to this truth, gratitude arises naturally. Suddenly, even something as simple as drinking a glass of water becomes sacred. We see the rain, the river, the earth, and countless lives flowing into that moment. And with gratitude comes reverence, a new way of walking through life, aware that we are always part of something greater. And there is another dimension waiting to be seen. For when we realize how deeply everything is connected, we also begin to see that nothing stays the same. Connections shift, forms change, moments arise and pass away like waves on the ocean. To truly understand interconnection, we must also face the truth of impermanence. And that is where our path now turns. Look at the sky at dawn. The colors shift from darkness to light, from soft blue to burning gold. No two moments are ever the same. This is impermanence, the heartbeat of existence. The Buddha called it anicca. It means that all things, whether mountains or emotions, are in a constant state of change. Nothing is fixed. Nothing lasts forever. On the surface, this truth can feel unsettling. We crave permanence. We want our happiness to last, our youth to stay, our loved ones to never leave. But life whispers a different reality. Everything flows. Think of your own body. The person you see in the mirror today is not the same as the one you saw 5 years ago. Cells die and renew. Hair grays, skin changes, strength shifts. Even the mind you carry, the thoughts, the beliefs, the dreams, they too evolve. Or consider a river. Stand by its banks and you might think it is the same river each day. But look deeply, and you realize the water is never the same, always moving, always new. The river is a perfect mirror of life itself, flowing, changing, never fixed. Why does impermanence matter? Because much of our suffering comes from resisting it. We cling to what we love, we fight against what we fear, and we demand the world stay as we wish it to be. But the world does not obey our desires. It follows its own rhythm of change. The wisdom of impermanence does not make life bleak, it makes life precious. Because moments pass, we learn to treasure them. Because people change, we learn to forgive. Because nothing lasts, we are invited to let go. Imagine holding a flower. Its beauty moves you, but you know it will not stay fresh forever. Does this make it less beautiful or more? Impermanence does not destroy beauty, it creates it. The cherry blossoms that bloom only for a short season are precious precisely because they do not last. The same is true of love, of youth, of every sunrise and every breath. Each one is a fleeting miracle, here for just this moment, never to return in the same form again. When we embrace impermanence, we stop grasping. We stop clinging to the illusion that things will stay the same. And instead, we begin to live with a softer heart, open to the flow of life. But impermanence is not only about loss. It is also about possibility. The child who falls can rise again. The pain of today can transform into the strength of tomorrow. The suffering we feel now is not fixed, it too will pass. Impermanence is the quiet promise of change. It reminds us that no storm lasts forever and no winter is without spring. And yet, if all things change, then who are we? If our bodies shift, our thoughts evolve, our identities transform, what is this self we cling to so tightly? Is there truly a permanent I at all? To look deeply into impermanence is to step into the mystery of the self, and that is where our journey now turns. If impermanence is the rhythm of life, then it asks us a profound question. If everything changes, what remains? Who is this I that clings to permanence? From childhood, we are taught to say my body, my name, my thoughts, my story. We build an identity from labels: student, worker, parent, friend. We say this is who I am. But when we look deeply, we begin to see the I we hold onto is not as solid as we imagine. Think of the body. We call it mine, yet it is in constant transformation. Every breath brings in air that becomes part of us. Every meal carries the earth into our blood and bones. In truth, this body is a flowing river of cells, never the same from one moment to the next. And what about the mind? Thoughts rise and fall like clouds. Emotions shift like weather. Memories fade, beliefs change, even our sense of identity evolves with time. Where is the permanent self in this endless stream of change? The Buddha called this insight anatta, non-self. It does not mean that we do not exist. It means that what we call the self is not a fixed, separate entity. It is a collection of conditions, body, feelings, perceptions, habits, and consciousness, constantly interacting, constantly changing. Imagine a chariot. It has wheels, an axle, a frame, a seat. But if you take away the parts, where is the chariot? It exists only as a convenient label for the collection of pieces. In the same way, the self is a label for a collection of elements. Remove the conditions and the I disappears. At first, this truth can feel unsettling. We cling to identity as if it were our anchor. We say, this is me, this is mine. But when we cling to something that is always changing, suffering follows. Think of the pain we feel when someone insults us. If we believe in a fixed self, those words feel like an attack on something permanent. But if we see the self as fluid, as changing, the insult loses its power. It becomes just sound passing through the air, nothing more. Or think of the pride we feel when praised. If we see the self as permanent, we cling to that praise, fearing the moment it fades. But if we understand non-self, we enjoy it without attachment, knowing it too will pass. The illusion of I, me, mine is like a dream we mistake for reality. And like any dream, when we awaken, we are free. But here lies the beauty. Non-self does not make life meaningless. It makes life boundless. When we are no longer trapped in the prison of ego, we open to the vastness of interconnection. The pain of others becomes our own, and their joy becomes our joy. We realize we are not a separate wave, but part of the great ocean. This insight is not meant to be an idea we memorize. It is meant to be lived, breathed, experienced. Every time we let go of mine, even for a moment, we taste freedom. Every time we release the grip of ego, compassion arises naturally. And so, the journey deepens. For if the self is not fixed, if life is a flowing stream, then why do we suffer so deeply? What is the nature of this suffering, and how do we find release from it? To answer this, we must look directly into the truth of suffering itself, its roots, its causes, and the wisdom it reveals. If the self is an illusion, why does life hurt so much? Why do we feel sorrow when love ends, fear when change comes, anger when life refuses to bend to our will? The Buddha did not turn away from this question. He looked directly into suffering, not to despair, but to understand. And what he discovered became the very foundation of his teaching. He called it dukkha. This word is often translated as suffering, but it means more than pain. It is the feeling of dissatisfaction, the restlessness of the heart, the sense that something is always missing. We chase pleasure, but it fades. We cling to loved ones, but they change. We build dreams, but life reshapes them. No matter how much we grasp, it slips through our fingers. This is dukkha, the unease of living in a world we cannot control. But here lies the turning point. Suffering is not meaningless. It is a teacher. It is the doorway to wisdom, if only we dare to look deeply. Imagine you feel anger rising in your chest. If you are blind to it, anger controls you. You speak harshly, you hurt someone you love, and later regret follows. But if you pause, breathe, and look deeply, you begin to see what lies beneath. Perhaps it is fear. Perhaps it is exhaustion. Perhaps it is a wounded child within you crying for care. In that moment of clear seeing, anger begins to dissolve. This is the power of deep looking. It transforms suffering into understanding. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from three roots: craving, aversion, and ignorance. We crave what we want, we push away what we dislike, and we live in blindness to the true nature of life. As long as we live this way, we remain caught in the cycle of dissatisfaction. But the good news is this: what is created can be undone. When craving, aversion, and ignorance are understood, their grip weakens. When we look deeply, the causes of suffering reveal themselves and freedom becomes possible. Think of someone lost in a dark room, stumbling, hurting themselves against unseen obstacles. The pain is real, but the problem is not the room, it is the blindness. Once a light is lit, the same room becomes navigable. The suffering fades, not because the world has changed, but because vision has come. Wisdom is that light. It doesn't erase the challenges of life, but it changes the way we meet them. With wisdom, pain becomes compassion. With wisdom, loss becomes appreciation. With wisdom, even death is seen as part of the great cycle of life. Suffering will visit every human being, it is part of existence. But when we understand suffering, it no longer destroys us. It becomes the soil from which compassion, patience, and strength can grow. And so, the question arises, how do we train ourselves to see suffering clearly without running from it, without drowning in it? The answer lies in the practice of mindfulness and meditation, tools that sharpen the eye of wisdom and help us look deeply into life itself. If suffering is the teacher, then mindfulness is the lamp that helps us read its lessons. Without mindfulness, we stumble in the dark, pushed around by cravings, fears, and habits. With mindfulness, we begin to see. Mindfulness, sati in the Buddha's language, is the art of being fully present. It is the simple yet profound practice of resting in the here and now, aware of what is happening within us and around us. It is not escape. It is not spacing out. It is the clear, steady attention that allows wisdom to take root. Think of the breath. It is always with us, yet how often do we notice it? When we breathe mindfully, each inhalation becomes a bridge to the present moment, each exhalation a letting go. The mind settles, the heart softens, and slowly the fog of distraction begins to lift. Meditation is the training ground of mindfulness. It is where we practice stillness, where we learn to observe the mind without being swept away. Sit quietly and you will see. Thoughts arise, linger, and pass. Emotions swell and fade. Even the body itself shifts with each breath, each sensation. At first, this practice can feel difficult. The mind wanders, restlessness stirs, old memories surface. But with patience, we begin to notice something extraordinary. We are not our thoughts. We are not our emotions. We are the awareness that sees them come and go. This realization is the beginning of wisdom, because when we no longer identify completely with every thought and feeling, we gain freedom. Anger arises, and instead of being consumed, we see it, breathe with it, understand it. Fear comes, and instead of running, we hold it gently like a parent holding a frightened child. In mindfulness, nothing needs to be rejected, nothing needs to be clung to. We simply see clearly, and in that seeing, transformation happens. The Buddha compared the mind to a pond of water. When stirred by winds, the surface is restless, unable to reflect. But when calm, the water mirrors the sky with perfect clarity. Meditation is the art of calming the wind so that reality can be seen as it truly is. And yet, mindfulness is not meant to stay only on the cushion. It is meant for every step, every word, every act of daily life. When you walk, be aware of your steps. When you eat, be aware of the food, the earth, the effort behind it. When you speak, be aware of your words, whether they heal or harm. This is how wisdom is trained, not through theories but through living presence. With mindfulness, we begin to see suffering without fear, impermanence without despair, and non-self without confusion. We begin to taste the freedom that comes from simply being awake. And as mindfulness deepens, something beautiful begins to bloom. When we look deeply with a clear and steady heart, we see not only suffering but also the suffering of others. And from that clear seeing, compassion arises naturally, like a flower opening to the sun. When mindfulness matures, something remarkable happens. Wisdom is no longer cold insight, distant and detached. It begins to beat with warmth. It begins to breathe with love. This love is not desire, not attachment, not the grasping that says, "You are mine." It is compassion, the natural flowering of wisdom. Compassion is born when we see suffering clearly, both in ourselves and in others. To understand suffering is to recognize that pain is not unique to us. Every person carries invisible burdens, silent struggles, hidden wounds. When wisdom sees this truth, the heart cannot remain indifferent. It responds not with pity but with deep care. Picture this: a child is crying in the night. At first you feel annoyed, but then you look closely. You see the child is sick, burning with fever, calling for comfort. In that moment, frustration vanishes. Only tenderness remains. This is compassion, when clear seeing transforms irritation into love. The Buddha often described compassion as the mother's love for her only child. It is fierce, gentle, and boundless. It does not calculate whether the child deserves it. It flows naturally because life recognizes itself in life. But compassion is not just for those we like or those who treat us kindly. True compassion reaches even toward those who harm us. Because when we look deeply, we see that their cruelty is also born of suffering, fear, ignorance, or despair. Understanding this, we no longer wish to punish but to help them awaken. This does not mean becoming weak or allowing harm. Compassion can be firm, even fierce, like a parent stopping a child from running into the fire. But even firmness can come from love rather than hatred. When wisdom and compassion unite, life changes. Arguments soften. Enemies transform into teachers. The walls of us and them begin to crumble. And here is the secret: compassion heals not only others but ourselves. When we carry resentment, the fire burns inside our own heart. But when compassion arises, the fire cools. We find peace even in the face of injustice, even in the presence of pain. Compassion is not something we force. It is not an ideal we chase. It is the natural fruit of deep looking. When we see interconnection, impermanence, and non-self, love flows like a river without effort. And in that flowing, life becomes lighter, suffering becomes shared, joy becomes multiplied. This is the miracle of compassion. Wisdom turns into love, and love turns into freedom. But compassion, while beautiful, is not the final destination. It is a bridge leading us toward liberation, where wisdom and love together open the gates to true freedom. Wisdom is not meant to stay on the meditation cushion. It is not a treasure locked away in monasteries or sealed inside books. Wisdom becomes alive only when we carry it into the small, ordinary moments of our day. Think of the morning. The alarm rings and usually we rush, half awake, mind already racing ahead. But what if you paused, even for one breath? What if you woke up with awareness, noticing the rise and fall of your chest, feeling the gift of another day? This small shift transforms an ordinary morning into a moment of gratitude. When you eat with mindfulness. Notice the colors, the textures, the flavors. See the sunlight in your bowl of rice, the rain in your cup of tea, the labor of countless hands in every bite. Eating becomes more than consumption. It becomes communion with life itself. When you speak with care. Words can heal or harm, unite or divide. With wisdom, we learn to pause before reacting, to let our words rise from compassion rather than anger. A kind word spoken at the right time can change the course of someone's day or even their life. Even in conflict, wisdom can guide us. Imagine someone insults you. Without wisdom, you react, defending, attacking, fueling the fire. With wisdom, you see their words for what they are. A reflection of their pain, their confusion. Instead of adding more heat, you bring coolness. You respond with clarity or perhaps silence, and the cycle of suffering is broken. This is how wisdom lives, not in abstract philosophy, but in real choices, moment by moment. Deep seeing also transforms the way we face challenges. When difficulties come, and they always do, we usually ask, why me? But wisdom asks, what can this teach me? Suffering becomes a mirror, reflecting our attachments, our fears, our hidden strengths. Every challenge becomes a step on the path, every setback a chance to grow. And perhaps the greatest gift of living with wisdom is freedom. We no longer chase endlessly after what fades. We no longer cling desperately to what cannot last. Instead, we flow with life, moving with grace through change, loss, and uncertainty. Wisdom makes daily life lighter yet richer. We laugh more easily, forgive more quickly, love more deeply. We discover joy not in distant achievements, but in the simple act of being present, washing dishes, walking in the rain, listening to a friend. This is the essence of the path. To live fully awake, to see clearly, and to let that clarity guide our every action. We have traveled far together through the search for wisdom, the art of deep looking, the truths of impermanence, suffering, compassion, and the freedom that follows. But here at the end, we discover something surprising. There is no end. Wisdom is not a finish line. It is not a destination where we arrive triumphant and complete. It is a way of seeing, a way of being, a light that continues to grow brighter the more we walk with it. Deep seeing is like a lantern. At first, it lights only a few steps ahead. But as we carry it through the twists and turns of life, its glow expands, revealing paths we never imagined. And the more we share it, the brighter it becomes, not just for us, but for everyone we meet. Every breath becomes an opportunity to return. Every smile, a chance to heal. Every moment, an opening into the vast mystery of life. This is the quiet miracle of wisdom. It transforms the ordinary into the sacred. Perhaps the greatest gift of deep seeing is humility. We realize that we do not own wisdom, we simply participate in it. We are waves rising and falling in a boundless ocean, sparks glowing and fading in an infinite night. And yet in our smallness we are also vast, because the light of awareness that shines in us is the same light that shines in all beings. So the journey continues. Each step you take, each choice you make, is an invitation to live with greater clarity, greater love, greater freedom. Not tomorrow, not someday, but here now in this very breath. May the light of deep seeing guide you through sorrow and joy. May it help you touch the beauty in impermanence, the truth in suffering, the freedom in letting go. May it remind you that wisdom and compassion are not distant ideals but living realities, already within you, waiting to bloom. And as you walk your path, know this: you are not walking alone. All beings are walking with you, all lives are intertwined with yours. Your awakening contributes to the awakening of the whole. Your light helps brighten the vast night. The journey of wisdom has no end. It is simply life, lived deeply, fully, and awake. So let us keep walking, keep breathing, keep looking deeply. For every moment we do, wisdom arises, and with it the world becomes a little clearer, a little kinder, a little more free. If these words have touched something within you, let this be only the beginning. Wisdom is a journey we walk together, step by step, breath by breath. If this resonated with you, I invite you to join our growing community here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe to the channel so these reflections can continue to accompany you on your path. And if you feel called, share this with others. Because sometimes a single insight, a single moment of clarity can change an entire life. May your days be guided by deep seeing. May your heart be light and your steps steady. And may we continue to awaken together.